Have you actually read that for yourself, or have you just gone off what you see on the news? Because the last time you went on what you just saw on the news about the residential schools, you were convinced that there were nuns and priests chucking dead children into big holes in the ground like it was Auschwitz. So recently it's been unearthed, pun intended, that the mass graves, or the alleged mass graves that were associated with Catholic boarding schools throughout the turn of the last century and into the middle of the last century, it turns out they didn't exist. The mass graves were not real. The unmarked graves were not real. I wrote an article for Crisis Magazine that you can read there right now. I think it's trending in the top couple articles there. And I called it Trudeau's Empty Graves. And I went through basically the insanity of what has been alleged and the truth about residential schools that very few people want to talk about. So if you're unaware, there was a system of boarding schools that was in essence funded by the government of Canada throughout the late 1800s. Remember, Canada wasn't officially a country until 1867, and into the 20th century. And this was called the residential school system. A lot of ink has been spilled about this. A lot of documentaries have been made. The idea is that the churches funded by the government of Canada basically engaged in an activity or an enterprise of cultural genocide. They ripped the native children away from their homes, made them cut their hair, made them speak French or English, and they couldn't speak their own languages, etc., etc., etc. And because of that, they erased Indigenous, Native, First Nation, Indian, Aboriginal, whatever politically correct term you want to use. They erased that culture. Well, like every narrative that's popular in our day, it's pretty much completely false, even if it does contain certain elements of truth. Before we get into the actual history, I just want to go over the way that we should be looking at this. Because if we're going to say that the Catholic Church, or any of the churches that were running these schools in Canada, if we're going to say that they engaged in cultural genocide, let alone physical genocide, which of course it's been proven that didn't happen because there's none of these mass graves, they don't exist. If we can say that there was some sort of cultural genocide, we're going to have to define our terms here. You see, cultural genocide itself is kind of a Marxist term anyway. It's a very modern thing. And the way that you look at culture is going to dictate how you look at what is alleged to be cultural genocide. So, without even getting into the question of Native Canadians, let's just think about the Irish. So, the Irish at one time were pagan. Well, they've kind of descended back into that, sadly. But the Irish at one time were a pagan society. Ireland itself, Hibernia it was called, that island that we know as Ireland was inhabited largely by the Druids. And the Druids were a very vicious, very evil, maniacal, pagan, diabolical culture. And in fact, the Romans, who are not known as being soft as teddy bears, actually thought the Druids were very unpleasant to deal with because of how diabolical things were. Well, eventually, St. Patrick and others, they converted Ireland. They made what we consider to be Catholic Ireland, which of course was a factory, a foundry of saints for over a millennia and a half, and helped to evangelize the world for the Catholic Church. We might say that the Catholic Church engaged in quote-unquote cultural genocide if we use the modern terms in Ireland. We might say, well, the saints of the Catholic Church went into Ireland and they brought the faith of Jesus Christ, and the Irish Druids had to give up their druidical pagan culture. Now, someone who's a big fan of being a Druid, human sacrifice, polygamy, all those sorts of things, they might say, well, this is no good. St. Patrick was culturally genocidal. He brought in Catholicism, and he brought in, literature that was not druidical. He brought in cultural practices that were not our history of our ancestors, and he changed our culture. St. Patrick was someone who promoted or facilitated cultural genocide. Now, of course, I don't believe that, and I don't even think most liberal people would believe that. Maybe they would nowadays. But if we're going to be using these terms, cultural genocide, then we have to understand how we're using them, what they actually mean. Because the way that they converted Ireland away from being pagans who engaged in some terrible activities were basically the same ways that the missionaries in Canada acted in these residential schools. And I'll explain what I mean. Well, the Irish missionaries in Ireland, I should say, I guess they weren't Irish, they were from England, many of them, but the ones who went into Ireland, They set up educational institutions, whether it be seminaries or monasteries, and there weren't really public schools the way we understand them, but they did have ways of teaching the kids. They told the families that the fathers couldn't have more than one wife. They even did things like, they would dismantle pagan temples, or they would repurpose them to be used for Christian worship. I mean, they really did a lot to really change the culture. They went in, the culture was one way, they did things, the culture changed. Historically, we would say what they did was good, because the juridical culture was bad. Well, that's interesting from a side note perspective, because if we even say one culture can be evil and one culture can be good, then there's a judgment there about what is goodness and badness, and we're using a Christian understanding to make that decision. So anyway, that's a whole other contradiction that these liberals have when they talk about residential schools. But the point is, if we view that this pagan culture was evil and that this Christian culture was good, then we say that what they did by changing it from the paganism to the Christianity, we say that was a good change. But if we think Christianity is evil, which liberals do today, then we look at what the missionaries did with the schools in Canada, and we say what they did was wrong. But if we actually look at the history of how Native people lived in Canada, many of them lived exactly like the Druids. These are uncomfortable truths for people. But people have this sort of Pocahontas fantasy where the Europeans showed up to Canada, which, by the way, was completely uninhabited. The highest estimates by the most liberal of scholars I can find say that there might have been 500,000 people on this entire this entire half of a continent called Canada. That's everywhere from the east coast in Newfoundland to the north with the North Pole, to the southwest in Ontario, to the west with British Columbia. We're talking about a landmass that's considerably bigger than the United States, and there were less people than in the city of Indianapolis today. You could walk for a month and a half at a time throughout Canadian wilderness and uncultivated terrain and never find another human being. There were various colonies around certain aquatic areas, which is common, but most of Canada was empty. And the reason why it became inhabited when the Europeans came is largely because the Europeans brought certain technologies that could be used to cultivate soil that the natives couldn't cultivate. These are just the facts. Was every interaction between native people and the Europeans positive? Of course not. Not every interaction between you and the person who lives down the street is positive. But generally speaking, when the Europeans came and they encountered the native people, they found a mixed bag of cultures. They found some were extremely violent, were extremely evil. Many of the native peoples that were here would attest to that because, for example, in Ontario, they feared the Iroquois. The Iroquois were known for pretty crazy things. They were known for things like human sacrifice and eating flesh and scalping and all these sorts of things that have become part of folklore. Whereas there were some, like the Algonquin and the Huron, who were generally speaking more amenable and more accepting of the Europeans. And their interactions were largely quite positive. This is why, for example, the French Catholic missionaries gave us the Huron Carol. If you don't know about that, this was a Christmas carol made by a Catholic saint using the Huron language. But it's really significant because the Hurons didn't have a written language. They just had an oral language. So this Catholic saint, he actually gave them a script so they could preserve their language and have a Christmas hymn in that language. And this Christmas hymn could be used liturgically. You see here this narrative that it was the evil white man and the European and the native who was this noble, savage Pocahontas fantasy. This is just not the case. If you look at what happened to the Canadian martyrs, boiled alive, eaten alive, hearts ripped out while they're still beating, fingers bitten off, things that you couldn't even show in the most gruesome of movies because it would be too vile to see. This happened to Europeans who came here. You have to ask yourself, what sort of culture exists when you can have a moment like what happened to St. John de Brebeuf and St. Isaac Jogues, where they're tomahawked to death, scalped, fingers bitten off, flayed alive, flesh eaten in front of them. I mean, the person who's alive has parts of their flesh cut off, those parts are cooked, and they eat it in front of the person who's bleeding out. I mean, this level of diabolism existed within Canadian Native tribes. Not all of them, but it existed. So we would look at that and we'd have to use the same judgment that we used, for example, with the Irish Druids. I would say it was good that St. Patrick stopped the Druids from being Druids because they were really bad. I would say it would be good that the Catholic missionaries who came to Canada stopped the Iroquois from doing a lot of the things the Iroquois did because they were evil. And the thing is, as I mentioned, we only get to judge that these things are good and bad, ironically, by using these Christian moral standards. Because if we go back to the pagan moral standards, we do find certain morality within paganism because of the natural law. But this idea that you can't enslave, this idea that you have to have one wife and you have to take care of her, this idea that you can't kill infants, etc., none of this is found in paganism. In fact, usually the opposite is found. It is found in the Christian faith, uniquely. Islam doesn't have it all the way, parts of it, but not really. Especially with the wives and slavery, that's still a common practice. So the funny thing is, or the sad thing is that these modern liberal commentators and Canadians, what they do is they look at the interactions between the natives and the Europeans, and they use the moral code of the Christians to judge that what was done to the pagans was wrong because it stopped their paganism. There's a massive contradiction there. Now, someone may say to me, well, Kennedy, I agree, it was a mixed bag, but still these schools were evil because look what happened in these schools. Well, we're going to have to just unpack that a little bit here. First of all, they were functioning for many decades. Also, the narrative that you've been told about what a residential school was, if you know this narrative at all, is probably really flawed. For one, it is not the case in all cases that you had to go to these schools. Most of the time, they were actually optional. Furthermore, there are many cases, when you look back, where the native peoples who had converted to Catholicism and loved their Catholic faith or other Christian churches and were faithful in those denominations, they chose to send their kids to these schools because they wanted them to have the best education. Everyone knows that historically, these Christian schools that have offered private education offer a far superior education than the general public school. That is still true to this day. Even in the United States, where Catholic schools are, bad as far as doctrine is concerned, people are still spending $30,000, $40,000 a year to send their kids to these schools because the schools themselves offer, objectively speaking, for the standards of the time, a very excellent education. This has always been the case. So what's interesting here is not only were these young people, these young native people, who often lived in very remote areas where there was no access to infrastructure for health or education or any of these things that we consider rights as part of our quality of life, there was nothing like that for them. Not only did they have access to going to school, but they had access to going to what would be considered in our day world-renowned educations. Who had a better education than a Catholic priest or nun 150 years ago? No one. Who had better access to learning multiple languages, being fluent in languages both orally and in the written fashion? Who had access to the great books? Who had access to the logical tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas, to the great philosophers of antiquity? No one had a better education than these prelates and nuns of the church. These are just historical facts. The natives of Canada were given an opportunity to have an incredible education. That doesn't mean that every person who ever went through one of these schools had a positive experience, but that's the case with everything. Even today, there are good Catholic schools that exist, good boarding schools, and there will be students who come out of these schools who will say they had a negative experience. And because of fallen human nature, there will be people who go through these schools where something bad happens to them. It could be from a staff member, it could be from another student, it could be from a stranger, who knows? But that also happens in public schools. This isn't to justify it, but it's just to say where there are human beings, there is sin, which we judge as being sin because of the standards of the Catholic Church, which we then use to condemn the Catholic Church. It makes no sense. Furthermore, if we are like these liberals, looking at this history through the lens of this liberal mindset, where we see any presentation of traditional Christian culture as wrong, then of course we're going to see what happened in these schools as objectively evil. But if we look at it through the lens of all of our ancestors, even your native ancestors who converted to the Catholic faith, if you are a native, then you're going to see that they had a great amelioration, a great progression in their standard of living in most cases because of what happened. The last thing I'm going to say here, which is going to be the most controversial, there is this liberal myth that they basically follow the teachings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is this idea that if you leave people alone, people become good. It's really just institutions and religions that make people bad. Many people believe that today. We use the term noble savage to sort of encapsulate Rousseau's ideas. So Rousseau essentially believed that The savage, meaning the man who is wild, that's what savage means. It doesn't mean evil. Just the wild man who has no institutions, no structures, no society. If he's left alone, he's good. And if you impose civilization on him, he's bad. Liberals basically believe that today. Although they're hypocrites about it because they believe that it's wrong to impose Christian civilization because of Rousseau's ideas. Therefore, in all Christian institutions, we have to impose pagan civilization because that's good. It doesn't make any sense. Nothing in liberalism makes sense. But the problem is for one, that's not true. But also, because it's not true, that means every person who's ever lived is going to be under the domination of fallen human nature. I don't care if you're white, I don't care if you're black, I don't care if you're Indigenous, I don't care if you're Asian, it doesn't matter. If you're a human being, if you have a pulse, if you have a heart, if you have a mind, if you have an intellect, you will choose at some point to make a decision that is wrong, even though you know it's wrong. You will do something for personal gain, even though it happens at the expense of another person. This is not unique to white Europeans. This is not unique to black Africans. This is not unique to Indigenous Canadians. It's just something that happens. The Catholic faith recognizes this and therefore offers a way through the sacraments and through the teachings of the church and the life of a Christian to fight against this lower nature in order to be a better person and to save your soul. Pagan religions don't offer this. The Greeks understood it a little bit, but they had no mechanism to fix it other than sheer natural virtue. And modern secular liberalism rejects this idea outright and thinks that, again, everyone who's born is good and it's Christians who make everyone bad. The reason I say this is because look what has just happened with these residential schools. Look at what's just happened with these excavations of these supposed mass graves that don't exist. There are no bodies there. And in the cases where there are actual cemeteries, they're a mix of Europeans and natives because they were community cemeteries where they just didn't replace the crosses. The native groups did not replace the crosses, which were wooden and disappeared over time with weathering. It wasn't the church that didn't replace them, it was the native reserves. Why they didn't do that, you're going to have to ask them. All of this information was available. I, as a journalist writing about this over the last couple years, I was able to find, just through looking through records, that this was all a sham. I didn't have to go dig anything up. I didn't have to go consult any experts on soil or grave sites. All I had to do was look into the history books, and I found that these were not unmarked graves, and where they said there were mass graves, there were no graves to be found. This was already known. But for some reason, many of these native leaders, they had the same access to the information. In fact, they probably had better access to the information than I had, and they still pushed forward with the narrative. And if you say something like, I think some of these native leaders lied for personal gain, people will call you a racist. But it's not about race, it's about human nature. These people who run these reserves, which are largely run with corruption, and anyone who lives in Canada will tell you that reserves are very corrupt, and the chiefs are often the most corrupt of the lot. These are just historical facts. They run prostitution rings, gambling rings, drug rings, and things like that because of the lax legal standards due to the sovereignty of the reserve. This is something that is common in all of North America. They often exploit their own people. Their people don't have any fresh drinking water, but the chief lives off reserve in a beautiful home and has a nice suburban and all these kinds of things, and has his residence on the reserve that he's never at. These things happen all over Canada. And they act like these race hustlers in the United States who are black and take advantage of poor black people in various impoverished communities. When it's time to do Black Lives Matter, when it's time to go on a march, when it's time to say so-and-so got shot by police, they're there. And why are they there? Because they get rich. The same thing happens in Canada with native leaders. Anyone who tells you it doesn't is out to lunch. So you have to ask yourself, think who pushed this narrative about these residential schools being places where it's all about mass graves and killing children. Think of the destruction that was done to the church in the name of that violence. Think of all the people who waved their flags for, every child matters, who basically went on a hate campaign against Catholicism for about 6 months, in 2021 especially, all because of what never existed, i.e. the mass graves and unmarked graves. But you have to ask yourself, can you trust these people when they talk about the history of these residential schools? Have you consulted the actual writings of the priests and nuns who ran these schools? Have you actually read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, which nobody's read? I've talked to somebody who has read it, and he said it's nothing like what the media says. He runs a policy institute, and he's read it cover to cover. Have you actually read that for yourself, or have you just gone off what you see on the news? Because the last time you went on what you just saw on the news about the residential schools, you were convinced that there were nuns and priests chucking dead children into big holes in the ground like it was Auschwitz. Do you think that the claims that happened before are verifiable? Do you think they've been telling the truth about the whole thing?